The night before the graduation, the town of Norfolk carried the kind of quiet that made everything feel heavier than usual. Streetlights buzzed faintly, casting their dull glow on empty sidewalks. At the far edge of town, banners already hung outside the high school, waiting for tomorrow's ceremony. Families were booking hotel rooms, restaurants were filling with relatives who had driven in from hours away, and the gymnasium was dressed in blue and white ribbons. For most people, it was a night of celebration. But beneath all the cheer, there was something fragile, something that could shatter with the wrong look, the wrong word, or the wrong kind of silence.
The Marine arrived late in the evening, his truck pulling up quietly into a parking lot lit by floodlights that left no shadows to hide in. His son was about to graduate, an achievement that meant more to him than any medal ever had. For years he had missed birthdays, holidays, and the quiet moments of family life, serving his country in places most people never even thought about. He carried himself the way Marines do, straight-backed, shoulders squared, and eyes always scanning the room. But there was a weight in his chest tonight, heavier than any gear he had carried on deployment. It wasn't the kind of fear he had known in combat. It was something more personal, more human, something that could undo him if he let it. The school was buzzing with families coming in and out, students practicing their speeches, and teachers rehearsing the order of events. To most, it was nothing more than another graduation, another name to call, another diploma to hand out. But to him, it was the first time his son would stand in front of a crowd without his shadow hanging over him. He wanted to be there quietly, not as a soldier, not as a Marine, but simply as a father. The guards at the entrance weren't supposed to be anything more than background. They were hired to keep order, check tickets, and make sure no one caused trouble. They wore their uniforms like armor, even though the event itself was far from dangerous. But sometimes, power given in small doses becomes addictive. Sometimes, men with little control in their lives look for places to wield it, and when they find someone they believe is vulnerable, they press harder than they should. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Parents clutched bouquets, cameras hung from necks, and children fidgeted in their seats, whispering jokes to hide their nervousness. On the stage, the principal moved through the order of names with practiced calm. But in the corners of the room, eyes lingered on people who didn't quite fit the picture-perfect scene. Whispers grew softer when the Marine walked in, his presence impossible to ignore. He wasn't dressed in uniform. He didn't need to be. Years of service had carved his body into something that couldn't be hidden, even in plain clothes. But what some saw as strength, others twisted into a threat. His son hadn't spotted him yet, but the boy would. The Marine knew the exact second it would happen, the way his son's face would brighten, the quick lift of the chin, the small flicker of pride that no speech or diploma could ever replace. That was what he came for. Just that moment. And yet, as he stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, there was already a chill pressing in on him. The kind of chill a man recognizes when danger is close, not because it has shown itself, but because it lurks in small gestures, in eyes that hold too long, in voices that carry an edge. The guards had been watching him since he arrived. At first it was subtle, the glance, the muttered exchange, but now it was sharper, less cautious. They weren't thinking about his son or the ceremony. They were thinking about power, about making someone small in a room where everyone else was meant to feel big. And though nothing had happened yet, the Marine could feel the air tightening. He had learned long ago that trouble doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it creeps in quietly, waiting for the right second to break the silence. Tomorrow, when the room would be filled with applause and laughter, no one would remember the quiet tension building tonight. But he felt it. He carried it in the way his eyes scanned the exits, in the way his hands never strayed far from his sides, in the way his chest rose and fell with slow, measured breaths. He had survived too much to ignore it. And still, he stayed. Because tomorrow wasn't about him. It was about the boy who was about to take his first step into the world. It was about a father standing in the back of a crowded room, holding on to a moment he had fought years to finally see. What he didn't know was how quickly that fragile peace would break, how two men with badges would decide his presence didn't belong, and how a room full of people would fall into a silence once 6 others stood to make sure he wasn't erased from the story. The ceremony morning began with clear skies, the kind of weather that seemed almost too perfect for what was about to happen. Families spilled into the parking lot, laughter rising above the hum of car engines, arms full of flowers and gifts. The Marine arrived early, hoping to find a seat quietly before the crowd swelled. He wanted no attention, no fanfare, just the chance to blend in. But as soon as he walked toward the entrance, he could feel the eyes on him again. The guards from the night before hadn't forgotten. They stood at the doors like they owned them, scanning tickets with bored expressions. But when their gaze landed on him, the shift was immediate. Their posture straightened, jaws tightened. One leaned to whisper something to the other, and both smirked as if they shared a private joke. The Marine caught it but said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence can be both a shield and a weapon. Still, their stares clung to him like a weight he couldn't shake. Inside, the gym filled fast, the sound of chatter bouncing off the high ceiling. Teachers herded students into their places, while parents craned their necks for a better view. It should have been joyful, but the Marine's seat near the back felt like a pressure point in the room. Every few minutes he caught the guards glancing at him, whispering, shaking their heads. The tension wasn't imagined. It was real, and it was growing. The first signs of conflict appeared in subtle ways. One of the guards walked over, checked tickets row by row, but lingered at the Marine's seat longer than needed. He asked to see his ticket, though he hadn't asked anyone else in that row. The Marine handed it over without a word. The guard studied it, frowning like he was searching for a flaw. After an uncomfortably long silence, he handed it back. "Make sure you stay seated," he muttered before moving on. It wasn't a warning. It was a challenge. The Marine's chest tightened. He wasn't a man easily rattled, but he knew this wasn't about rules. It was about something else, something that had followed him all his life. His skin color, his presence, and his very existence in certain spaces were enough to trigger resentment in men like that. And though he tried to ignore it, he could feel it building second by second. By the time the principal began the speeches, the gym was charged with an energy no one else seemed to notice. Parents clapped, students laughed, cameras flashed, but beneath it, the guards hovered like shadows, waiting for an excuse. Meanwhile, his son sat among the rows of graduating seniors, fidgeting nervously. He hadn't yet spotted his father, but when he did, his face would light up. That single moment was the reason the Marine endured the stares, the whispers, the threats he felt humming under the surface. But the boy's nervous smile also reminded him of all the years lost, deployments that kept him away, letters that went unread for weeks, birthdays celebrated over crackling phone lines. It wasn't just pride he felt, it was guilt, heavy and sharp. That guilt made the Marine stay quiet when the guards circled again. They didn't need to ask for his ticket anymore. They just wanted him to know they were watching. At one point, one leaned close enough to say, "Don't cause any problems today, the words we use." Simple, but the tone was poisoned. The Marine stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a response. Yet the weight of silence was starting to crush him. Memories pushed at the edges of his mind, moments from war where he had been forced to measure every move, where one wrong glance meant a fight for survival. That same instinct told him this wasn't over. As the speeches dragged on, his mind wandered back to the years before, to a friendship gone sour with another soldier, a man who never forgave him for earning stripes first, for commanding respect others didn't give so easily. That man had once whispered behind his back, spreading rumors, sowing doubt. And looking at these guards now, with their smirks and quiet words, he felt the same shadow creeping in again. Jealousy, resentment,
They needed to cut him down simply because they couldn't stand his presence. But it wasn't just jealousy at play. The guards had their troubles. One was drowning in debt, his nights spent staring at overdue bills he couldn't pay. The other was bitter over a failed marriage, blaming everyone but himself for the pieces left behind. Men like that carried anger like a weapon, and today they had found a target. The Marine tried to stay calm, reminding himself of the boy sitting just a few rows from the stage. He told himself he could endure anything for his son. But as the ceremony rolled on, the guards edged closer, each time making their presence clearer. They whispered to other staff, pointed toward him, and shook their heads. Parents began to notice, exchanging confused glances, wondering why the man at the back was being watched so closely. The Marine's heart pounded, not out of fear, but out of something more dangerous: frustration. He had lived a life where control was everything. Control kept him alive, kept his men alive. Losing it wasn't an option, and yet here, in a gym full of families, two men with nothing more than badges were pushing him toward a breaking point. Every laugh, Fro, and the crowd, every cheer, every flash of a camera only deepened the divide. On one side, joy. On the other hand, tension so thick it nearly hummed. His son still hadn't looked back, but soon he would. And when he did, the Marine feared what he might see. Not a proud father, but a man cornered, judged, and treated like he didn't belong. The guards weren't finished. Their next move would come soon, and it would change everything. The moment came without warning, though in truth it had been building all morning. The Marine had sat still, his broad shoulders tense, his eyes fixed on the stage where his son waited for his name to be called. He had endured the stares, the whispers, the deliberate brushes from the guards who kept circling back to him like vultures. He had told himself over and over, "Stay calm, don't give them a reason." But trouble doesn't always need a reason. Sometimes it only needs an excuse. It began when the principal called the first row of graduates to the stage. The crowd rose with cheers, phones flashing, voices breaking into applause that echoed off the walls. Parents stood, craning their necks, waving wildly at their children. In the middle of that joyous chaos, one of the guards leaned in toward the Marine. His voice was low but sharp enough to cut through the noise. "You don't belong here. Step outside." The Marine's jaw tightened. His eyes stayed forward, watching the line of students shuffle toward the stage. He said nothing. The guard stepped closer, his shadow falling across the Marine's lap. "Did you hear me? You need to leave." The Marine finally turned, his voice low and steady. "I have a ticket. I'm here for my son. I'm not moving." It should have ended there. But the guard's smirk only widened. He motioned to his partner, who was already moving down the aisle. Within seconds, two sets of eyes bore down on him, their voices overlapping, telling him to get up, to walk out quietly, to make it easy. The Marine felt the stares of the families around him now. Whispers stirred. A woman in the row ahead glanced back, her face pinched with confusion. A father across the aisle shook his head, muttering something under his breath. The Marine's son still hadn't seen him, but the tension was rippling outward, spreading like a stain through the room. When the guards reached for his arm, something inside him snapped. Not in anger. Anger he could control. What snapped was the thread he had been clinging to since the moment he walked in. The belief that his presence, his silence, his patience would be enough to protect this day for his son. He pulled his arm back, hard, his voice rising for the first time. "Don't touch me." The words cut through the applause. For a moment the crowd's cheers faltered, replaced by an uncertain hush. Heads turned. Students on the stage shifted, distracted. His son's head jerked up, eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on him. And in that instant, the Marine saw the boy's pride give way to confusion, then fear. The guards doubled down, their hands gripping tighter, their voices louder now. "Sir, you need to leave, now!" One tried to haul him from his seat, the other pressing in from the side. The Marine rose to his feet, towering over them, his chest heaving. The room seemed to tilt with the sudden shift. Gasps rippled through the gymnasium. And then it exploded. One guard shoved him, hard, and in the blur of motion that followed, the Marine reacted on instinct. The same instinct that had saved his life in deserts and jungles. The same instinct drilled into his bones from years of combat. His hand shot up, deflecting the push, his body pivoting to hold his ground. The guard stumbled back, colliding with a row of chairs. Parents screamed. The other guard lunged, and in the struggle fists flew, quick, sharp, and unrestrained. The sound was shock. Metal chairs clattering, flesh striking flesh, voices shouting over each other. Students froze on stage, their tassels swaying as they stared in horror. The Marine's son half rose from his seat, his mouth open, his eyes wide with disbelief. The Marine's blood pounded in his ears. He wasn't in a school gym anymore. He was back in a place where survival depended on speed and precision. Every movement was calculated, every strike aimed to disable, not destroy. But to the crowd, it looked like something else entirely. A brawl, raw and violent, unfolding in the middle of a ceremony meant for joy. When one guard fell to the floor, clutching his nose, blood streaming between his fingers, the room erupted. Mothers screamed, children cried, and fathers shouted. Phones rose into the air, recording every second. Teachers rushed forward, hands outstretched, begging him to stop. But the Marine wasn't hearing words anymore. He was breathing heavy, his eyes blazing, his body locked in defense against the second guard still grappling with him. And then, silence. A sudden, heavy silence. 6 men had stood up from the crowd almost in unison. They weren't dressed in uniform, but their bearing was unmistakable. SEALs, men who had known the Marine, men who carried themselves with the same quiet gravity. Their presence froze the room. For a heartbeat, the chaos seemed suspended in the air. One of the SEALs stepped forward, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the storm. "Enough!" The Marine stilled, his chest rising and falling, his fists clenched. The guards, battered and bleeding, hesitated, their confidence shaken by the sudden wall of silent authority before them. The crowd's murmurs faded, as if everyone understood that something larger was unfolding here, something that couldn't be reduced to whispers or phone recordings. The SEALs moved closer, not with aggression but with a kind of commanding calm. One reached out, placing a steady hand on the Marine's shoulder. "Brother, it's done. Don't give them more than they've already taken." For the first time since it began, the Marine's eyes softened, his breath slowed, his fists loosened. The reality of the room, the screaming children, the horrified parents, the cameras, came flooding back. His son's face was the last thing he saw before he lowered his head, his body trembling with the weight of what had just happened. The guards staggered back, furious and humiliated, but unwilling to push further with the SEALs standing there like an unspoken barrier. The room was hushed now, the celebration shattered. And though the violence had stopped, its echo would linger, on the floor where blood smeared, in the eyes of the families who had watched, and in the heart of a boy who had just seen his father transformed into something he didn't fully understand. The crime wasn't just in the blows exchanged, it was in the humiliation. The public breaking of a man who had only wanted to see his son's triumph. And as whiskey purrs grew louder, as phones buzzed with footage already being shared, the Marine knew nothing would ever be the same. The silence that followed the fight hung heavier than the clash itself. The cheering, the laughter, the light-hearted energy of the graduation had been crushed in seconds, replaced by a quiet so tense it seemed to press against the walls of the gymnasium. The Marine stood frozen, his fists still raw, his chest still rising and falling with the rhythm of survival. The guards, battered and shaken, pulled themselves upright, clutching at their wounds, muttering into their radios. The 6 SEALs hadn't moved far from him, their presence steady, their bodies forming an invisible line between him and anyone else who thought of stepping forward. But the crowd had already passed judgment. Parents pulled their children close,
whispering sharply. Phones remained raised, recording the scene from every angle, ensuring nothing that had happened would remain in that room alone. The Marine's son sat rigid in his chair, eyes wide, mouth set in a thin line. Pride had vanished. In its place was something heavier, fear, confusion, and a kind of heartbreak that cut deeper than words.
The principal tried to restore order, his voice cracking as he urged everyone to remain calm. But calm was impossible now. The ceremony stumbled forward, awkward and broken, names being called into a room that no longer clapped with the same joy. Every sound echoed against what had just unfolded. The Marine remained standing, his body a storm barely contained, until the SEALs quietly urged him toward the exit. He went reluctantly, his head lowered, his hands trembling with a mixture of shame and rage. Outside, police cars had already gathered, their lights flashing red and blue against the bright afternoon sun. The guards wasted no time painting the picture their way. An aggressive man who had attacked them without cause, a dangerous disruption at a family event. Their words dripped with self-righteousness, omitting the whispers, the provocation, the slow burn of humiliation that had led to the eruption. The Marine didn't resist. He stood straight, as handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the steel biting against skin already bruised from the fight. The SEALs watched from a distance, their faces unreadable. They could vouch for him, could tell the truth of what had been done to him. But even they understood how stories like his were twisted, how perception often outweighed truth. One of them muttered quietly as the Marine was led away, "This isn't justice. This is theatre." The ride to the station was long, the silence inside the cruiser broken only by the hiss of the radio. The Marine stared out the window, his reflection fragmented by the flashing lights. His mind replayed the moment his son's eyes had met his during the fight. That look cut deeper than any punishment waiting for him. He hadn't wanted this. He had wanted only to sit quietly, to see his boy take a step into the future. Now that moment was ruined, tarnished beyond repair. Back at the school, his son Walbaz cared across the stage to polite applause, his eyes searching the crowd for the father who was no longer there. The diploma in his hand felt lighter than it should have. The victory was overshadowed. Later, classmates whispered about the scene, about the Marine dragged out in cuffs. Some repeated the guard's story, others defended him. But in the boy's heart, there was only a hollow ache where joy should have been. News travelled fast. By evening, headlines carried fragments of the story. Marine disrupts graduation. Violent outburst Mars ceremony. Parents terrified after altercation. Each article leaned on the same shaky details, each one framing him not as a father, but as a threat. The comments sections are filled with voices quick to condemn, others to defend. The truth buried under the noise of judgment. His record, his service, his sacrifices. All of it was reduced to a single moment replayed again and again on shaky cell phone videos. The Marine sat in a holding cell, the walls pressing in, the echoes of the fight still in his bones. Shame washed over him in waves. He thought of his son, the look in his eyes, the way the day had been stolen from him. Guilt carved deep, sharper than any blow he had taken. But beneath the guilt burned anger, not just at the guards, not just at the whispers that had baited him, but at a world that seemed determined to strip him of dignity at every turn. The SEALs did not stay silent. They contacted lawyers, reached out to old connections, and prepared to speak the truth of what had happened. But even their testimony couldn't erase the stain of perception. The Marine's name was already being dragged through the mud, his reputation fractured. Neighbors who once greeted him with respect now kept their distance. Parents who had once nodded politely in grocery store aisles now whispered when he passed. For his son, the toll was immediate. What should have been a night of celebration became a night of quiet tears. His diploma left unopened on the kitchen table. He wanted to be proud of his father, but the image of him fighting in front of the entire school, replayed in his mind. Confusion twisted inside him. Was his father a hero defending himself, or a man who had lost control? The line blurred, leaving the boy adrift in emotions he couldn't name. The community itself split. Some stood firmly against him, citing rules, order, and the sanctity of a school event. Others whispered about the guards, about their behavior, about the long history of men like them wielding authority as a weapon. Churches spoke about forgiveness. Coffee shops buzzed with debates. In living rooms, the fight was replayed on TV screens, analyzed as if it were a sport, stripped of its human cost. For the Marine, the days after stretched into an endless fog of hearings, meetings with lawyers, and restless nights where he replayed every second, wondering if he could have held on just a little longer, stayed just a little quieter. The guilt hollowed him out. But what haunted him most wasn't the trial to come, nor the possibility of a record staining his name. It was the look on his son's face. That moment would live with him long after the bruises healed, long after the headlines faded. In the end, the crime wasn't only in the fists that flew. It was in the humiliation, the stripping away of dignity, the ripple that cracked through a family, a community, a man's identity. And as the world moved on, as headlines gave way to new scandals and tragedies, the Marine was left to pick through the pieces, haunted by a single truth. He had survived wars, survived battlefields soaked in fear. But in the place where he should have felt most human, most safe, he had been brought to his knees. The weeks that followed blurred together into hearings, interviews, and endless waiting. The Marine's name appeared in every headline, his face frozen in grainy photos taken from someone's phone during the fight. To some, he was a father wronged, a man provoked until he broke. To others, he was proof of a stereotype they had always believed: violent, uncontrollable, dangerous. Justice, as he soon realized, was not only about truth. It was about perception, and perception had already made its choice. The courtroom became its battlefield. The guards took the stand first, their words steady, rehearsed, dripping with self-pity. They spoke of fear, of a man who had snapped without warning, of a threat to the sanctity of a family celebration. Their wounds, healing bruises, crooked noses, photos of dried blood, were displayed as evidence. Each mark became a weapon against him. Though the marks he carried inside, years of service, scars earned in silence, were invisible, unmentioned. The SEALs testified next. They told the truth as they had seen it. The whispers, the taunts, the unnecessary aggression that pushed a man beyond reason. They spoke not as soldiers defending one of their own, but as witnesses to injustice. Their words carried weight, but the air in the room was already heavy with suspicion. The prosecution twisted their loyalty into bias, painting them as brothers too blinded by camaraderie to see clearly. The Marine himself sat quietly for most of the trial, his hands folded, his gaze steady but tired. When it was his turn to speak, his words were simple. He talked about his son, about what the day had meant to him. He admitted to losing control, but not without cause. He didn't beg for pity. He didn't try to polish the truth. He simply told it, raw and unshaped. The silence in the courtroom afterwards spoke louder than any cross-examination. In the end, the verdict fell somewhere between guilt and mercy. He was not branded a felon, but he was not free of punishment either. Probation, fines, mandatory classes, penalties designed to show balance, though none of it could restore what had already been taken. His record, once spotless and decorated, now carried a scar. For him, the true punishment wasn't written in legal documents. It was carried in the look on his son's face, a look he would spend the rest of his life trying to mend. For the community, the case became a mirror. Some saw in it the dangers of unchecked authority, the ease with which power can be abused by those unworthy of it. Others saw only the spectacle of violence, reducing it to a headline or a clip shared on social media. Churches spoke about forgiveness, about how a man's worst moment does not erase a lifetime of service. But forgiveness was harder to find in living rooms, where parents replayed the videos, pointing at the Marine as a warning to their children. The guards returned to their jobs, emboldened by the fact that they had survived the storm with their positions intact. To them, the outcome was proof they had been right all along, that their authority had been justified. But the whispers about them lingered. In corners of town, people muttered about what they had done, about how far they had gone to push a man over the edge. Their reputations survived on paper, but in truth, they were marked too, known not as men of order, but as men who had used power like a weapon. The Marine's son carried the deepest wound. He held his diploma, but it was stained with memories of that day. His pride in his father wrestled constantly with the image of violence, the sound of chairs clattering, the sight of police cuffs closing around his wrists. Their relationship grew strained, not from a lack of love, but from the heaviness of what had been seen. Slowly, with time and conversation, the boy began to understand the weight his father had carried, the years of being pushed, tested, and cornered. But the scar remained, a reminder that even heroes can be broken. As the dust settled, the Marine lived quietly. He avoided public spaces, choosing instead to spend his time in silence, with family, or among those few who still understood him. He worked to rebuild his bond with his son, not with grand gestures, but with small acts of presence, the kind he had once missed while overseas. He knew that trust rebuilt was different than trust never broken, but he carried the burden willingly. On a broader scale, the story became one more thread in a larger conversation. It highlighted how easily dignity can be stripped from someone, how power in the wrong hands creates harm more subtle than bullets but just as lasting. It showed the way public opinion can shape justice, how truth can bend beneath the weight of perception. It forced people to ask uncomfortable questions. Who gets to belong in certain spaces? Who decides when a man has crossed the line? And what happens when the system itself creates the pressure that breaks him? The Marine's fall from grace revealed something about human nature that few wanted to admit. That strength can be mistaken for a threat. That silence can be mistaken for weakness. That men trained to defend can, in a moment of humiliation, become symbols of fear. It was not just his story. It was a story about how society itself draws lines of power and control, and how quickly those lines tighten around anyone who dares to step outside them. In the end, justice was partial, healing incomplete. The Marine's life was never the same. The guards walked away without real consequence. His son carried memories that no child should have. The community carried whispers that would outlast the headlines. And yet, in the quiet of his own home, the Marine found a kind of resolve. He could not change what had happened, but he could choose how to live with it. The story leaves no heroes untouched, no villains entirely whole. It leaves only the reminder that human behavior is fragile, that dignity can be shattered in a single moment, and that justice, true justice, is often less about verdicts than about the scars we carry long after the fight is done.